Well, good morning, everyone. It is indeed a good morning. It's a little early for some, but you are here, and I am so pleased to be here at the Riga Conference 2022, and it's an absolute honor to be invited to engage with this distinguished panel. So first, I'm just going to introduce our panel, give you a little bit of an overview of what we're doing here, and jump right in. You will have the opportunity to ask questions if you like, and we will probably go for an hour or so. Who knows, if it gets really good, maybe we'll just keep going. I don't know, but it really depends on you. But first, let me just tell you what we're doing. This panel is called Geopolitical Impact on Regional Security Dynamics in the Greater Middle East. And I had prepared this elaborate paper-based speech to give you, although it would be just about a minute, but the best laid plans never work. Besides, the paper isn't here. So in the digital age, I'm going to refer to this digital device to do this, and it'll be much more concise and short. The Middle East has been in turmoil for years. This is all stuff you probably read. During the Cold War, major powers fought battles in the Middle East. This region was vital to the West and to the rest of the world due to its strategic and otherwise important location and its resources. Recently, when the U.S. President Joe Biden visited the Saudi Arabian kingdom, Vladimir Putin honored Iran by negotiating the transfer of combat drones to Russia for use in its conflict with Ukraine. Given the shifting landscape, will any of the Middle East and its state will any Middle Eastern state, I should say, forego its strategic partnerships with Israel or Palestine to strengthen ties with major powers? That's one question. Is it possible to have a covert rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the absence of increased U.S. military presence? Another question there. Can the Middle East go nuclear if the U.S. and other major powers fail to bring Iran to the negotiating table and thus into the nuclear deal? There are a lot more insights that we will engage in as we move through this conversation. But first, I'd like to introduce our panel to you. First, all of them are to my left, but to my immediate left is the Honorable Aviva Raz Schechter. She is the Special Envoy for Women, Peace, and Security in Israel. And essentially, this is the first such posting or appointment. So she goes down in history for a number of different reasons, not just for her work, but for this post as well. So thank you for being with us today. Next, Syed Ali Alavi, and he is a senior teaching fellow at the SOAS University of London, a scholar of international and Oriental and African studies there. Thank you, sir, for being with us this morning. John Rain, Senior Advisor for Geopolitical Due Diligence at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So what we're going to do first is give each panelist an opportunity to tell us what they're thinking. Each one will have 3 minutes, and we'll start with the Honorable Aviva Raz Schechter.
Well, good morning. Thank you, JJ, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I will try briefly to encompass many things. So the shifting landscape in the Middle East seems to be an ongoing pattern in the global theater. Over the last decade and during the height of the so-called Arab Spring, we have been witnessing the collapse of regimes and the emergence of failed states that continuously have immense consequences and effects on the security and the stability of the region and beyond. Growing challenges pave the way to new opportunities and new alliances based on shared interest and realpolitik. looking at opportunities, the Abraham Accords, signed in September 15, 2020, represent a paradigm shift regarding Israel's peacemaking efforts, contrasting with Israeli-Palestinian stalemate in the peace process. The accords are also an outcome of a wider understanding in the region, especially after the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, that the United States is in the midst of a process of reducing its presence in the area. I should emphasize that although at this stage it does not intend to change its deployment in the area, and still it accelerates the need of its allies to create new coalitions in the region. The recent development, characterized by the signing of the gas agreement between Israel and Lebanon, although we remain in a state of war, is significant and reduces the risk of conflict. It created a mutual stake for both Israel and Lebanon being able to extract natural gas, although I should also emphasize that the Hezbollah terror organization and proxy of Iran has practically acquiesced to a deal with Israel that actually demarcates a boundary. Regarding challenges, Iran poses the most serious external threat to Israel, both in its pursuit of military nuclear capability and its regional subversion. That includes inter alia an effort to threaten Israel with comprehensive fire and the promotion of precision missile project for Hezbollah in Lebanon. In the Palestinian arena, the question of the day after Abbas and the ramifications hovers above all. In conclusion, I would say that the strategic competition between the United States and China will continue to be the most important element shaping the international system. This is a multifaceted competition over values and ideology and over economic, technological, and military superiority. The Russia-Ukraine war and its unprecedented impact on Europe and NATO, on the US-Russia relations, let alone the Russia-Iran-China axis, will continue and shape the interests of each of the region's actors. Against the backdrop of global trends, it is clear that the international community is eager to pay less attention to the Middle East and strives to contain crises and lessen involvement in the region as much as possible, particularly military involvement that exacts a high toll. The Middle East, with its traditional problems, is expected to be caught in the tension between its low place among the priorities of the global system and its ability to draw attention through crises and threats. Developments regarding the Iranian nuclear issue and the results of the negotiations on the return of Iran to and the United States to the agreement, which seem to be less likely, coupled with the latest unrest in Iran, will shape the interactions of the great powers in the region considerably.
Thank you very much, Aviva. Ali?
Well, I just try to summarize in 3 minutes. It's very difficult for academics because we love to talk for 2 hours without ending. But I link it with the concept of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and then what does it mean Middle East, greater Middle East for Europe and European as a continent. What we are witnessing here within the greater Middle East is that, of course, is Europe's next door neighbor, is the hub of the energy resources. But what we witness here, and puzzled many policymakers, is the stage of surprise, the shifts in the pattern of alliance. So what we witness is that so-called friendly states, when I say friendly states towards the United States, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Turkey in this regard, pursue similar policy as non-friendly regimes, for example, such as Iran and Syria. And of course, leaning towards, let's say, all sides and not actually putting themselves in the line of the sanctions against Russia. So policymakers in Europe still are puzzled, and they do not find this understanding and answer what is that. And it's a part of the global south. So I'll come back to it later on in the concept of Iran and nuclear, all the rest of it. But what we see here is the perception the perception in the global south in this regard in the greater Middle East. They see this as a regional conflict, and therefore an opportunity to flex their muscles, and the conflict for them is the globalists versus anti-globalists. So you see the same pattern of behavior in India as well. So what else is changing in the Middle East is Iran is no longer attractive to Russia because it's isolated, although it's a competitor naturally because of the gas, energy resources and so on, but is marginalized already. So you see the connections if you study the body language and psychological elements between leadership in Russia and Middle East, you find that for Russia, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Turkey are far more attractive and important, and vice versa, than the concept of Iran. So in this case, I would say is a part of marginalization of Iran within the pattern of alliance from Moscow's psychic. So this will also affect the nuclear discussion and all these elements. But what we are witnessing is the confidence within the friendly states in the Middle East that they do not put themselves in the lines of sanctions, and is a kind of a race between friendly and non-friendly regimes who to get closer to China and Russia in this case. And then, of course, we have China's strong presence in the Middle East, where they find Middle East even more important than ever. So I think it's a wake-up call for Europe as a continent, I'm talking about, including United Kingdom and United States, to revise the policies when it comes to the greater Middle East and global South.
Thank you, Ali. John.
Most discussions about Russia and Ukraine are binary in nature. You're with one side or the other. In the Middle East and the Gulf in particular, it's a very different situation. And it has presented itself to the leadership in the Gulf as an opportunity. And it's twofold, the opportunity. First of all, the economic opportunity which this has presented is enormous. Gulf states stand to make a fiscal surplus of $1.6 trillion this year. Even by Gulf standards, that's a lot of money. It's also, and in addition to that, there have been inflows of money into Gulf jurisdictions from Russia. So economically, there's an enormous opportunity here, and some have characterized this as close to profiteering. Certainly in the Gulf, it's just seen as an economic opportunity to be exploited. The second area in which the war has appeared as an opportunity is for Gulf leaders to project their policy of neutrality. And the neutrality that they have pursued has not been entirely without fruit. The Saudis were able to mediate with the Russians to secure the release of prisoners of war. It has nonetheless been seen in Western capitals as a less than friendly neutrality. And for me, the relationship to track is that between Riyadh and Washington, which is going through a period of unprecedented stress, which has been building for many years on a number of issues, but has come to a head. I think there is a similar tension building between the West and the UAE. This is being stoked entirely by the posture that has been taken by those two countries towards Russia and on oil production, or more broadly on energy transition. So there's a vortex now spinning geopolitically in the Middle East, which is not the one we were used to. It's one between newly assertive, neutral Gulf states and their traditional partners in the West.
Thank you, John. There's a lot to chew on here, and I'm not going to try to pretend that we can get all of this digested before we leave, but there are some key things that I do think are important to talk about this morning in the context of what our distinguished guest have pointed out. And Ali talked about how Iran is no longer attracted to Russia. And John, you're talking about the Gulf leaders and their bid for neutrality, and we'll get into the impact of that shortly. But I want to start with you, Aviva. The challenges and the opportunities that all of you have laid out here today for the Middle East are enormous. And from my own perspective, I think the Middle East is the wild card in this war, where Russia is trying to assert its will on Ukraine because of, one, the economic stakes here, but also, as was true during the Cold War, each of the powers need some place away from themselves where they can get some things done without the harsh spotlight of their home community or the community that they're fighting in. So they need a place that can provide them some cover, if you will. And there are opportunities in a lot of places, but there certainly are a lot of opportunities in the Middle East, considering the history, Russia's history there. And we could talk about North Africa too, but that's another day. But Aviva, the challenges and the opportunities here for all parties, and feel free to expand on what you think they might be and how this shifting landscape impacts them.
Well, I think that the Middle East has proved to be not only a shifting area along the years, but also providing surprises in many ways, because, as mentioned here, different states are having their interests, but they are always looking at more options. And today I think that what we see in this landscape is that everybody is talking to everybody. In a way, the need to find new ways to fulfill the interest of this realpolitik is proving to be surprising in the way that Russia had always interest in the area. Right now, Iran is playing a very important role in their policies, ambitions regarding Ukraine and beyond. But as mentioned here, maybe later they will consider strengthening their alliances with the rest of the Middle Eastern actors. If I'm mentioning Saudi, for example, indeed, Saudi is looking at their relations with Russia in a different way. They're also looking at Iran in a way that they have technical talks in Iraq, for example, and although they did not reach yet a higher let's say, level, I believe that this is a very good reflection of looking for new options. Now, if I'm going back to Israel, Israel is always seeing the United States as its ally, and its interests are in the West. But I think that having the Abraham Accords is a wonderful opportunity for both sides, Israel and the Gulf states, to strengthen alliances and share interest against the one enemy, which is Iran, so that we will be able to answer this challenge in ways where the United States, for example, won't be able to be the one to fulfill all those interests.
So one follow-up for you. Do you think the Abraham Accords have the spirit behind the Abraham Accords and what was accomplished? Do you think that's inspired perhaps other opportunities for similar kinds of changes between Israel and its neighbors?
Indeed. As you know, also before the Abraham Accords, there were off-the-record contacts, and I believe that there are other countries that are watching the scene and are interested maybe in joining. The timing is certainly a component, especially when we are seeing what is happening in the rest of the area, and of course, as mentioned, the Ukraine-Russia war, or even the rivalry between the United States and China. Everything has an impact on that, but I think that beyond the fact that there's still a Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has not been resolved, and it does impact certain interests and considerations of other Middle Eastern states. I believe that this circle can be widened and enlarged.
Ali, something you said. You've said a few things to me, and forgive me if I'm not able to engage on all of the questions that I have because of what you said. But the key thing you just said a moment ago, Iran is no longer attracted to Russia. And the question I would like to ask is, why, if they're not, why would they negotiate or sell these drones to Russia that are being used in Ukraine, and then essentially suffer the sanctions and the rest of the baggage that comes along with this relationship? Is this a forced marriage here? Is there something I'm not seeing here about why do they do this? Do they hate the U.S. that much, or the West that much? Was it spite? What was the reason for doing that if Russia's no longer attracted to them?
Well, as an academic, I'm not fully aware of these logistics that are happening, but what we see here is a realpolitik, shifts in alliances. You have an isolated country, has been facing sanctions on one side, and the war opened some windows of opportunities, not for Iran literally, for the friendly states in the Middle East to warm up towards China and Russia. So having Iran in that concept, I would say, if there is any, let's say, logistic connections between two states, will be more symbolic than see Russia as a biggest supplier of arms to its own allies to get something back. I would say it's something to first of all, economic reasons in it, of course. It is a country that is in a situation that every little help, we call it in English. But at the same time, it would be something that symbolically to show that they do have the technology, and they are not only the importers, but they can also export that technology with it. But one thing is very interesting here that policymakers in Europe should pay attention is the perception on the ground. So still, you can see the authorities in Iran denying any direct connections with Russia and even selling or trading in that concept. Whereas the friendly states in the Middle East, they do not deny, or they're not shying away from their connections with China and Russia. I would say this is because any support towards Russia within the Iranian streets are not very popular. So even if there is anything, they have to do it in a clandestine way. But as I mentioned, it's a kind of a symbolic way to flex the muscles and say they do own a technology to be taken by a kind of a superpower in the war. So more of that rather than, let's say, patronaging connections. That's why I would say is in that concept we need to look at it.
Okay.
From real politics.
It's all about relevance, huh? John, you seem to want to say something about this.
If I may,
Please, absolutely.
Just to pick up on a couple of things that were said. Viva made a really important point, which is that in the Middle East, everyone's talking to one another. And if you go back, if you take this out of the Ukraine-Russia context, think back to the Abraham Accords and what flowed from that, there was a period of almost unprecedented outreach in the Middle East. And I think 2 years on from the Accords, looking at what they've left, is they've left a legacy of almost normalization of the inclusion of Israel in the Middle East, which is a remarkable event. So for the Gulf states, particularly the signatories of the Abraham Accord, there's been material development, various strands of the relationship, particularly in the field of high tech and commerce. which are not political tracks, they're just the normalization of the relationship. There are a number of positives in the Middle East, which are almost awkward in this difficult time for the rest of the world. There is the economic growth, there is the rise in GDP in a number of countries, particularly in the Gulf. There is, I wouldn't say a normalization and a rapprochement across the board, but there's more openness to developing relationships outside of traditional conflicts and battle lines. So I don't want to characterize it as guilty optimism, but there's a little bit of that in the Middle East. Of course, many problems still remain, and Iran is a special case here. But more generally, it's a region in which the atmosphere is unusually optimistic compared to the rest of the world at the moment because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, I think
there is a kind of awkwardness in that.
Yeah. I think it'd be irresponsible if I didn't ask you if the current situation in Iran, how that's going to impact anything that they do. And I'll just start with you, John, if you're okay with this. The current unrest in Iran, I was talking with a very important interlocutor in Washington about this, and Iranian NCRIS, National Council Resistance of Iran, and he said that this is not an uprising. This is a revolution. It's been going on for a while. How do you see it?
I'm sure others will want to comment. I don't yet see it as a revolution. I think there are three things missing for a revolution. I don't think that there is yet a convincing alternative program to the existing regime. There isn't a compelling leader, and we haven't yet seen large transferences of loyalty from key institutions in the state to the opposition. And I think absent those three, we're left with significant disturbances and an articulation of very widespread rejection of popular discontent. But for me, I think we're short of what we need for a revolution. So I think it's possible this way to challenge the regime, but not to usurp it.
Ali.
Well, I agree with John. It depends who you ask in that question. But as a let's say academic, I would say yes, the components of revolution are missing. And I wouldn't call it or define it according to the cliche of the revolutions as a revolution. This is a kind of a 21st century new phenomenon, and it's a new generation, younger generation are demanding their own universal demands and universal rights, which is transnational. It can be in any conservative society. It's a new generation, most of them younger than 20, and the conflict, colliding with the older generation, and is not ideologue. It doesn't have a socialism, communism, capitalism, or any ideological attachment into it. This is a more of a kind of a dialogue and discourse that I would say we may see this in any state sooner or later, which they have this kind of a conservative or patriarchy, mainly within the older generation. But in the concept of revolution, I would say when we look at the book, when we are studying the books, the components of revolution are missing, and they do not even themselves call it revolution. It's a spontaneous younger generation confronting the older generation. As I said, social media play a big role, and they are skilled in terms of IT and things. So it is beyond the borders, I would say, not specifically defined in one specific part of the country or the region.
Yeah. Aviva, your role in Israel as the special envoy for women, women are a key component in this situation in Iran, in that this latest situation began because of an injustice against a woman, and then there was another event involving another young woman. How do you see this situation in Iran?
Well, I would like to say that it's an opportunity, first of all, to admire this bravery of the Iranian women that are calling for liberty, for freedom, and for rights. And I think that although I would be very prudent and not enter into very strong saying whether it's a revolution or not.
After all, you are a diplomat.
After all, I would certainly say that this is an anti-regime manifestation led by women, and it might be a game changer, who knows? It reminds me that during the 80s and the 90s, we had our Iran experts who said a counter-revolution is going to happen in a year, in a month, in a year, in 2 years, and you see that we are plus 40 years after. Therefore, prudence in the Middle East is always very important. But I truly want to say that the backing that the international community is giving to these brave women hopefully will be also an asset for the continuation of the revolt. And I would also mention that women are suffering in very many places. I mentioned before the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the consequences on women's rights. I think that women are certainly becoming a power in demanding their rights and maybe bringing also change for democracy.
Yeah. It's no doubt this is a time for women. It's always been a time for women, but perhaps now more than ever in our lifetimes, it's an opportunity for some significant change that could be lasting change in a number of different places, and hopefully those changes will take hold and continue to proceed ahead.
JJ, could I pick out one
Absolutely.
really important point that Ali made? It's the generational nature of this opposition inside Iran. And, you know, if you look at the demographics in Iran, the demographics are against the regime. So over time, more of these, as you put it, Ali, these universal agendas are going to push through in Iran. So I just wanted to say that I don't think this is when it ends, but this is how it ends. So what we're seeing in Iran, eventually this will be how the regime is finally displaced.
Do you have a sense? I know we're not talking about when, but
I don't like to say when, as Aviva said. You know, we tried to say when before, and that's really hard. But what we're very unlikely to see is a transition from what we have now to a liberal democracy. Much more likely, I'm afraid, to see it come as a result of mass demonstrations and civil unrest.
Yeah. You know, I don't want to make this all about Iran because there are many other positive developments that we can engage on, but I do need to ask this question. You know, the question that was in our breakdown of how we were going to approach this discussion, and the discussion about nuclear. Do you see Iran again becoming nuclear in the short term because of stimuli from this war, I don't know, their quest to remain relevant, opportunities, money, certainly the relationship with the U.S. It's not clear if the U.S. is going to be able to do anything with the JCPOA, or forgive me if I've mutilated that title, the nuclear talks with Iran. But the question I want to get to here is there any movement or motivation or anything you see that suggests that they're any closer to achieving that goal? Because we know they still have that goal. Aviva?
Well, indeed, they have this goal, and they're getting closer and closer to this goal. And I think that it has to worry the entire international community. It does worry not only Israel, which is the immediate target. After all, this regime is threatening for the destruction of Israel. and it has proxies all over. And of course, Hezbollah is the main one, and the northern front is very dangerous with all kinds of weapons that I've mentioned before also. But I think that when I'm saying we, I'm talking about the international community led by the United States, need to stop the Iranian project. And as long as the attention is sometimes taken to other areas, Iran is continuing with this project and getting nearer and nearer to become a threshold country. You might call it already, but they're capable. And as Israel is saying, we will do whatever we can in order to stop it.
Ali, would you like to comment on this?
I would go beyond the cliche that we are having in the media. I would say, unfortunately, desires for having nuclear technology is now within the Greater Middle East is universal. It's not only Iran. The danger is we always focus on one side and we don't see the others. You can see Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Turkey are actually not shy to show their desire, and they do have the tools, and they do have the financial power, and they do have the connections to get to that level, and they will, from my point of view. But we can't in academia predict. I think if JCPOA was successful, which President Obama did it in a very wise way, if it was successful, we wouldn't be in this position now. I think in terms of energy market, Russia would be more marginalized, more isolated. We would have a nuclear dossier done and dusted, and possibly it could have paved the way for many other good developments, but it didn't happen, unfortunately. So I would say, yes, this is the trajectory that we can see is happening, but I hope we will have total denuclearization and also proper engagement between all the states, because Greater Middle East is extremely important, not only to Europe, but to is a part of, is a massive puzzle of the part of the Greater Eurasia. We need to look at it holistically and not specifically case by case. I think we need to revise the way we study Greater Middle East, and it's the time for it. But constantly we are always looking at the old books. We need to look into the new concept. We are in the 21st century.
That's brilliant. Thank you. John?
The trajectory on this is worrying because the regime is committed to having this, and it enjoys quite a lot of popular support for this objective. Secondly, it has made progress towards it. Whilst the JCPO has not been working, it's increased its stocks of enriched uranium in its cascade, so it's heading that way. I think maybe, and I should say that nobody wants this to happen in the region, with the possible exception of Syria, and something on which everyone is aligned, despite what I was saying earlier about tensions, is we don't want Iran to have that capability. The dispute tends to be over how you stop them. But as for Iran, would Iran choose this moment to break out, to move towards a weaponized nuclear capability? It will be an extraordinarily escalatory thing for the regime to do. And there is an argument that they enjoy having the potential of the breakout more than having the responsibilities and the consequences of having the weapon. I hope that's true. It's very difficult to predict, but we are left with a commitment on the part of the regime, which is very worrying.
We're 17 minutes left. I am sincerely hoping that some of these bright faces in the audience have some questions for this distinguished panel, which sacrificed to get up early to do this, to be here. And I don't have to beg you to ask questions. I know you have them, so please, there are a couple of, there's a microphone. You may not need it for us, but you may need it for the stream. So if you have a question, please go right ahead. Are they, yeah, you will take the mic to her, or, okay. And others who have questions, please let us know.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Suzanne Rain. I have a question about Syria. John just mentioned Syria. That was the first time any of you mentioned Syria. And in all the optimism about the Middle East, it's almost as though there's a sort of black hole in the middle of the vortex, which is a country which used to be a really significant part of the Middle East and has been in a terrible civil war for over 10 years. So I would like actually each of the panelists to give us their views on what happens next in Syria. I know, that's it.
All right. Let's start with you, Aviva.
Well, we don't have any peace agreement with Syria, but along the years there was an understanding that if the border is kept silent, then we can, keep the status quo. And as long as there is an address in Damascus, we can deliver, as we say, messages so that the status quo will be kept. In Syria for years, since Assad the father, continuing with his son, preferred to have the Lebanese battlefield active against Israel and still keep their border quiet. Now, throughout the civil war, things have certainly changed. I must say that there are very many Syrians who were treated in Israeli hospitals, and hopefully one day they will still remember that Israel can be a friend and not be considered as an enemy. But right now, the situation is bothering Israel. The main factor, again, is Iran and their aspirations, spreading their hands, as we say, also Iraq, Syria, and of course they have the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this is where Israel will not let this infrastructure being built, and it will try to prevent the Iranian penetration into Syria. Regarding Syria, we truly hope that stability will be back there and prevail, because it's much better not to have a failed states across your border or anywhere.
John.
Yeah, I mean, Syria, we could add Yemen to what I'm afraid is a list of countries with deep unresolved issues which absolutely compromise the optimism felt elsewhere in the Middle East. These countries, I'm afraid, both Yemen and Syria, do come on and off the agenda. They will most definitely be back. One of the challenges for the key actors in the region is to ensure that successes that they enjoy elsewhere are transferred to other countries. Ultimately, we're going to have regional settlements, regionally supported settlements in both Yemen and in Syria, and one might add Iraq to that as well. So it's forgive me for making an aspirational comment, but my hope is that as we see success elsewhere, both diplomatically and economically, that can lead to renewed effort on these countries.
It's interesting as well. This is the first time we've mentioned Iraq this morning as well. And it's almost inconceivable when you look back over the last decade not to have mentioned Iraq in a conversation about the shifting landscape in the Middle East. But thank you for bringing that up. Ali, please.
Thank you for the question. It's fantastic. As I said, we need to look into Greater Middle East holistically and not case by case. We need to remove the old books and look into the 21st century. The perception in Global South towards the Ukrainian war and Russian aggression is that when the war happened in Yemen and Syria and the rest of the world was not very sensitive about that. So we need to also equally look into every lives in the world. So the concept of Syria is interesting because Syria is a true ally of Russian Federation. Russia has got the military base in Tartus and is very sensitive about that, inheriting from Soviet Union. Also, the other point is when we talk about international law and territorial integrity of any country, you see Turkish invasion of the northern Syria, which nobody actually ever looked into it as a member of NATO. We need to stick by our principles, if we say principles of international law and respect to the international territorial integrities. The people are the victims here, as we can see, and regional and global powers are actually playing. Unfortunately, Syria and Yemen became a platform of these proxy issues. So I would say we need to give agency to the people in Syria, and to make them engaged with their future. When it comes to the invasion of the Syrian soil, we need to, as an international community, to confront this, no matter is from the friendly state or non-friendly state, and look into the concept of the people on the ground, as I said. That's the same case in Yemen. You may have states today, but not tomorrow, but you have people always on the streets, and the perception will remain, and they have memories, and they can remember things. So I would say it's extremely important to look into Syria in a concept of bottom-up, and look into all the components of Syria, and see how everybody can be engaged in rebuilding Syria. And if any state, no matter what is, violating the territorial integrity of a country, should be immediately warned. So that's a very important point. Yes, I agree with you. Syria is a key component in the Middle East that needs to be studied. And Iraq, for sure.
Question from the audience. In the meantime, how is the world going to walk away from this? Or let's take a look at a year from now, 5 years from now. What are we going to learn from this situation in Ukraine and how it's impacted the Middle East, the Gulf states particularly? What are we going to walk away from it with, and will it be beneficial? Will we be able to learn something useful and apply that knowledge to change the narrative? Because the more things change, the more sometimes they seem to stay the same. Different actors, different dictators come in with the same, just add water, pull it off the shelf and do the same thing, but just add their face instead of the other guy's or woman's face. So, John, where do we go from here?
Well, it's a great question, JJ. On the Middle East, and perhaps let's stick with the Gulf, I think we have to accept that key Gulf countries have a rapidly maturing concept of the role that they're going to play in the region and in the world, that it has changed, I think, over the last 5 to 10 years, and that it entails an equally new idea or equally different idea of what being an ally of the West means. I think we just have to accept that. There's a measure of independence and assertiveness in their foreign policy which we must, as allies, we just learn to deal with this. I think the other thing, as Ali touched on, is what is the constituency to which they feel they belong, and they have increasingly felt that they do belong to, one might call it the global south, or a constituency which is not necessarily the West, and that has implications for how we might view the way in which their societies will develop, their relationships and alliances develop, whether they will orientate more, for example, towards the East as well as the South. So I think for the big thing that we've learned here that's been laid bare is that there's a difference now in the way in which particularly the Gulf states see themselves on the international stage and the way in which they wish to be dealt with. Mm.
Well, each of you will have a chance to wrap up your comments, but I kind of would like to hear from each of you on this this same question. Aviva, would you share your thoughts?
Yes, indeed, it's a very interesting and important question because obviously we need to learn from history and even from the present, and we don't necessarily do it. But I think that as a democratic state, an island of democracy in a region that does not have it, I think that we have learned along the time to respect and to live with non-democracies that are able to kind of put the ideology behind and look at the benefit of their own people and prosperity of the nations. And I think that this is certainly behind the Abraham Accords also, not only because realpolitik, but it's a combination. So learning from the war between Russia and the Ukraine again, I think that it's too early, but in an age of kind of weakness of democracies, and we are talking here about changing landscapes. If we look back to the 19th of the previous century, when Fukuyama said the end of history, and we were all watching a new scene, and look how it has been changing since, I think that democracy is still the best way to fulfill the will of the people and to have a better life for the population. And this is what states need to do. I hope that we will get back to that.
Ali?
I agree with John. I believe in 5 years' time, we are witnessing the shift in the pattern of alliances. The Russian aggression in Ukraine is a litmus test for the rest of the policymakers to look into Middle East and see the importance of it, but not to look into Middle East regionally, see it in a holistic way. Is a part of now new concept called the Greater Eurasia, and you can see the presence of China in it and the presence of Russia. And the Middle East, in the shadow of the war in Ukraine, is becoming even more important in the project called the Greater Eurasia. So, as John said correctly, you see the so-called friendly states in the Middle East are actually flexing their muscles, their independence, their own way of looking into the concept. And we would see, I would say, a kind of a shift in the pattern of alliance, moving away from that old school of alliance, who is allied to who. You see that they're actually practicing this on the ground. So, and then more integration of the Greater Middle East within the concept of the Greater Asia and Africa, and also Greater Eurasia. And I think when we say West, in the West, we need to be quite careful, because now 40, 42, 45 countries, we define it in our imagination as the West. Literally, we are alienating 140-ish countries. So that's very, very important to understand the concept of when we use the West, we need to be quite careful about that element. I think shift in the patterns of alliances that we will see in the Middle East and beyond.
Okay. So each of you will have a minute to wrap up your remarks, and I know that's going to be difficult, but I need 15 seconds to close the panel. So, John, your minute starts now.
Well, let me say that on Russia-Ukraine, we've learned a lot about the Middle East in the way in which states have responded and been affected by it. And I think certainly for policymakers and commentators, this is not a sideshow to what's happening in Russia-Ukraine. It's central. The first of those reasons is because we have seen these reconfiguring alliances, friendships, redefining of them. And secondly, because we've seen the abiding centrality of the Middle East to commodity markets, principally oil, and also their significance as financial centers. So thank you very much for holding this session. There's a lot to learn, and if we have this again in a year, there's probably even going to be a lot more to learn.
Okay. Aviva?
Well, I certainly concur. And regarding the reconfiguration of alliances, I think that we are in the midst of a process. It's always well, when we're talking about democracies, about still values and things we want to keep and adhere to, but on the other hand, the reality on the ground is certainly demanding the realpolitik here. And I think that the Middle Eastern countries have shown that they are watching the scene and leaving all options open for Israel, of course, the enlargement of the scope of relations with Arab countries in the region and beyond, also with Muslim countries, is an interest. It's the very beginning. And I hope that, as we say right now, we don't know yet what's going to happen, but I hope that in a year we will keep up our optimism, because I always say that for us, there's no other option.
Thank you. Ali, 1 minute.
Well, Middle East, birthplace of 3 Abrahamic religions, and it was a beautiful carpet of the living side by side for centuries, and it was also the birthplace of many civilizations. So I would say, I hope that pattern after thousands of years will continue to be the, let's say, a model for the future, for the 21st century in that case. But what I would say is very important when we study not only Greater Middle East, Global South, is to study not only top-down but bottom-up, also from the concept of the perception of the people. This is extremely important. It goes beyond the politics of today. Then we can have a longest term policy and strategy and outlook about the region and beyond.
Thank you. The geopolitical impact on regional security dynamics in the Greater Middle East. Please thank our panel, and I thank you for getting up early and attending this brilliant discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.